about what we know?
Well, Paulo, we were told this morning that there would be a brief broadcast from the Santa Marta, the residence of Pope Francis, and then a few moments later, Cardinal Kevin Farrell, who is the Carmelengo, the man in charge with overseeing the protocols around the death of the Pope, announced that Pope Francis had died at 7:35 a.m. local time this morning. Now, he was also joined by Cardinal Pietro Parolin and Archbishop Peña-Parra, the two senior Vatican officials. They made that announcement from the Santa Marta residence. Now, yesterday, Pope Francis was out in the crowds of St. Peter's, greeting people. He made an effort to get onto the balcony to give the Easter Sunday blessing. Of course, he hasn't been well enough to lead services in the way that he would normally, but it was characteristic of Pope Francis to come out into the square at St. Peter's, clearly not feeling himself. I mean, there were those of us who followed it closely who saw him yesterday and did feel afterwards that he was not in a good condition in terms of he's normally greeting the crowds, he's normally very engaged, he's a pope who loves to be amongst the people, but yesterday he seemed less engaged. He's clearly been through, he was going through the very profound health crisis. He had pneumonia in both of his lungs. He was in hospital for 38 days. He almost died on two occasions, but he came through that and was recovering in the Vatican. But obviously it was very difficult for him health-wise, and he showed, though, determination to keep going until the very end. There was speculation he might resign, but he never did that. He decided he would go on right until the end. I think that's also the ethic and person of Francis, is to serve right until the last moment. He was someone who gave himself totally to the role of Pope. He was a Pope who wanted to be amongst the people, to serve. He wanted the Catholic Church to do more, to go out to the margins of society, to serve migrants and refugees, the poorest. He said after his election, I want a poor church for the poor. And that was the kind of, that was his kind of manifesto from the very beginning, that he wanted a church that was willing to go out and pitch its tent amongst the most suffering of people, the people who were suffering the most. He wanted a church amongst the people, and a church focused on service and humility. Now, people often look at the Vatican and they look at the Catholic Church and they see these extraordinary basilicas and cathedrals, and they see incredible history, and they see magnificent liturgies and vestments. But Pope Francis, taking the name of St. Francis of Assisi, wanted a church that was focused on simplicity, on the core values of the Christian message. Of course, St. Francis of Assisi was a famous saint who focused on poverty, care for creation, simplicity, humility, and this is what Pope Francis sought to bring to the church during his just over 12-year papacy. And Francis, as Pope, sought to embody those values of St. Francis of Assisi. I mentioned the environment earlier, and the Pope, of course, wrote a very important encyclical about protecting the planet and protecting the environment, protecting the natural world. It was a landmark encyclical that really shifted official Catholic teaching on the topic, and that was something that he raised during his time in his visit to the United States in 2015, when he went to the lawn of the White House and spoke and met with President Obama when he addressed both houses, where he emphasized that importance of protection of the environment, but also migration. Migrants was a key concern for Pope Francis, and just before he went out onto the balcony yesterday, he met with Vice President J.D. Vance. And of course, Pope Francis had been very critical of the Trump administration immigration policy. So basically with Francis, it was a question of he wanted to serve right until the end. And I think we've seen that with, yesterday he was out on the square on Easter Sunday, the high point of the church's calendar. And then today we have this news that really has come as quite a shock because we had been told by the Vatican the Pope was slowly improving, although, of course, as I said, those of us who followed Francis closely did notice that he did not seem as engaged yesterday as he normally would. He seemed to be struggling. But this was a mark of this Pope, that he wanted to serve right until the very end. Paulo.
Christopher, I'm curious if you could speak to the sudden nature of the Holy Father's death here. A reminder to viewers that we were just weeks into his prescribed 2 months of rest that the doctors had recommended for the Holy Father to limit his public appearances. And as you made clear, despite that, he was determined to keep that public presence as much as he possibly and physically could. So if you could just speak to the sudden nature of the news that now Catholics around the world are waking up to the day after the Easter weekend.
Yes, well, I think most people will know that Francis had been hospitalized with pneumonia in both of his lungs, that he had almost died on 2 occasions, that it had been a very serious health crisis, and that basically Francis's general health wasn't in the best of condition. I mean, he's 88 years old, and he's had other health challenges. He's was largely confined to a wheelchair. He has had other hospitalizations for respiratory problems. He's had a history of those respiratory infections, and he had part of a right lung removed as a young man, and so he was vulnerable to these bronchial infections. I mean, the bottom line is that the Pope effectively avoided death narrowly on 2 occasions in February and March. He came out of the hospital. He was determined to try and recover, but clearly it was going to be a very difficult task for him to do that because of someone of his age and with his general health condition. There was always the possibility that he wouldn't be able to make that physical recovery. And also there's another thing about Francis is that he wasn't going to reduce his desire to be amongst people, was reduce his activities, shut himself away so that he could perhaps cling on for another 2 or 3 more months or whatever it might be. He wanted to give himself totally to the role as much as he possibly could. And in many ways, I saw Francis actually just before he went into hospital, and it was clear then he wasn't well. He was struggling to breathe. He was basically giving himself totally to the work and the job, the ministry. And in that respect, his health was sacrificed in the service of the church that he wished to perform. And I think that's why, although it's a shock this morning to hear this news, it's not totally unexpected given what the Pope has been through health-wise in recent months and years.
Catholics will no doubt reflect on the timing of the Pope's passing, as you mentioned, down to the very last moment, a life of service, approaching now 10:20 in the morning at Vatican City. For viewers just joining us, we are following breaking news out of the Vatican, with Vatican officials confirming the death of Pope Francis, dead at 88. On the phone, joining us right now is Vatican correspondent Christopher Lamb, bringing us up to speed on not just the legacy of the first Pope from the Americas, but also on what we know about the timing of all of this and how Vatican officials confirmed this and announced this. Christopher, you told us a little bit more about Pope Francis and his life. I'm curious if we can now, for a moment, take a look at what we know about when officials learned this, the process of getting this confirmed, and then sharing the news to the world.
Well, the process is that the Cardinal Carmelengo, who is someone called Cardinal Kevin Farrell, who is a Irish-born but naturalized U.S. citizen who works at a high position in the Vatican, his job is to ascertain that the Pope has died, and then it is his job to announce that to the world and to its fellow cardinals. And the Vatican's obviously decided to do that through the modern means of basically a live YouTube broadcast. And so that will have been, I would have thought, a simple process in that the Pope is in the Casa Santa Marta. He is receiving, or had been receiving, round-the-clock medical care, and there's a medical team there. So when it was clear that the Pope had passed, it would have been both the Vatican's medical officials and the Cardinal Kevin Farrell, who would be ascertaining the death, and then they will be, obviously they've announced that to the world. And of course, it's also true that there are certain prayers that are followed that when the Pope dies. So the Cardinal Kevin Farrell will lead a service, and then the Pope's body is to be placed in the chapel of the Santa Marta, and we obviously will follow those developments as they come in. But there is a formal protocol for when a Pope dies, and it is Cardinal Farrell who is the one who oversees that. And obviously today he announced it with the two most senior Vatican officials, Cardinal Parolin and Archbishop Peña-Parra of the Vatican Secretary of State, effectively the sort of heads of government of the Vatican, if you like. I'm just walking now into St. Peter's Square. There's obviously big numbers here. It's a Jubilee year in Rome, which is a year of pilgrimage from people visiting Rome to take part in the Jubilee spiritual celebrations. And you get the sense that actually the news hasn't come through yet for most people. I imagine we will be getting some notification formally in terms of the ringing of bells, which we haven't had yet. But yes, the process is that Cardinal Kevin Farrell, the Carmelengo of the Vatican, the Roman Curia, he has ascertained that the Pope has died with the Vatican medical team and has made that announcement this morning, Rome time.
Christopher, as you arrive there in the Vatican, if you could also tell us a little bit more about what the last 24 hours had been like for Pope Francis, celebrating Easter, making those rare appearances, meeting with officials, meeting with U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, yes. So the last few days of Francis were basically his participation as much as he could in the celebration of Holy Week and Easter, the high point of the Christian calendar. So on the Thursday before Easter Sunday, he went to a prison in Rome where he spent half an hour with prisoners. That's been a very important part of his papacy, is to his ministry to prisoners, to the outcasts, to the outsiders. And then on Saturday, the Saturday before Easter Sunday, he was briefly in the Basilica, St. Peter's Basilica, to pray before the Easter Vigil. And then on Sunday morning, Easter Sunday morning, he met briefly with Vice President J.D. Vance, who is the last foreign civic dignitary to have met with Pope Francis. And then he went to the balcony of St. Peter's, the same balcony where he was announced to the world as Pope Francis, or the same balcony that he appeared to the world as Pope Francis for that first time. And he they offered the Easter blessing, and he then went around the square for a last time in the Pope-mobile, where he was greeted by thousands, tens of thousands of pilgrims and people in Rome for Easter Sunday. So it is quite extraordinary that after the highest point of the Church's liturgical year, at the highest point, the Pope then passes on. And it's, I suppose, in some ways quite fitting because, of course, the Easter message is all about the death and new life. And Pope Francis has, in this extremely poignant period where Christians remember the death, the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus, that the Pope himself has passed into the next world. And Francis, I think, clearly did not want to stop serving. He did not want to stop working. It's also extraordinary that he's died during the Jubilee year, which is very, very unusual for a pope to die in a Jubilee year. That hasn't happened very many times at all in the Church's history. So it really is a extraordinary moment. I think people are going to have to take some time to process all of this. But yes, the last days of Francis were really dedicated to serving the Church, to continuing his ministry right until the end. He did not resign, as some people speculated. He always signaled his determination to go until the end, to serve until the very last moment.
It is such an important point that you make there, Christopher, for Catholics around the world, myself included. That lasting image of Pope Francis will undoubtedly be him aboard that Pope Mobile, making those rounds through St. Peter's Square during that highest liturgical point of the calendar, as you mentioned. Could you remind us also, Christopher, about how the Pope really helped usher the Catholic Church into not just modern, but also unconventional times, and really often became a lightning rod for conservatives within the Church?
Well, that's right. I mean, Pope Francis was an outsider pope. He was the first pope for a long time to be elected who had never lived and studied in Rome. So he very quickly shook up the Vatican and Church establishment. He refused to be scripted by the Vatican bureaucracy and the Roman Curia, which is the Church's central administration. He was going to be very much his own man right from the beginning. And that caused some people to feel very uncomfortable and worried, because here was a pope who wasn't going to follow the script, who was insistent that the Church become simpler, become more humble, for those in senior positions to live simply. I mean, he took the decision to live in the Casa Santa Marta, the Vatican guest house, rather than the apostolic palace that popes had lived in before. He shocked people by doing that. He lived in a simple suite of rooms in the Santa Marta. And this itself sent a big message, because there are some cardinals who live in fairly comfortable apartment, shall we say. But Pope Francis decided to live simply, to give and preach a radical message that, as I said earlier, was based on the fundamentals of Christian teaching. He was also outspoken on things such as the migrants' crisis. His first visit outside of Rome was to Lampedusa, the island where many people were risking their lives from North Africa to come to Italy in search of a better life, and they were dying in the Mediterranean in the process. Francis' first visit outside of Rome was to be on the island of Lampedusa to show his solidarity with migrants. He also spoke against economic injustices and inequalities. That was a very important part of Francis' ministry. That upset some of the wealthy donor class, you could say, in the Catholic Church, those people who wanted the Church to focus on certain topics. So there are some people in the Catholic Church, some groups, who want the Pope and the Church to focus on the culture war issues. They want the Pope to continually talk about abortion, same-sex marriage, contraception. Francis said, look, I'm not going to change those things. And of course, he spoke out very strongly against abortion. But his focus was on the person, on the pastoral. That was particularly the case when it came to gay Catholics. Now, in the past, some of the Vatican documents on homosexuality had caused a huge amount of hurt for gay Catholics. Francis shifted that narrative in a fundamental way when he said on the plane back from Brazil, very soon after his election, he told journalists, when it comes to gay priests or gay people, who am I to judge? And that was a radical shift in many respects. It wasn't a shift in teaching, but a shift in approach. and he offered blessings to same-sex couples, which again was a major pastoral move to be more welcoming to gay people. And all of these things that Francis did when it came to migration, when it came to welcoming to LGBTQ plus Catholics, when it came to critiquing the economic system or economic injustice, all of those things did raise the ire and upset those Catholics who wanted a more traditional approach and who wanted a pope who perhaps would be more scripted and predictable. Francis was a pope of surprises. I mean, when he announced cardinals, for example, no one knew who he was going to announce as a cardinal. Only he knew, and he would announce these names from the balcony or from the window of the Apostolic Palace. He announced the names of the new cardinals, and the cardinals themselves who were being named didn't know. And a lot of these cardinals were people or bishops from far-flung corners of the globe, places like Tonga or Haiti or the Central African Republic or Mongolia. And they were not the people or the bishops who would expect to be made cardinals. So he kind of pulled a rug from under the sort of church ecclesial career ladder. So, you know, if you were a bishop of a certain diocese, you might expect to be appointed a cardinal. A diocese is a local church. So say you were archbishop of a certain diocese in Italy, you might expect to be made a cardinal. Francis said, no, that's not how I'm going to do it. I'm going to appoint those bishops, those people who are serving on the margins, who are in parts of the church that perhaps never had cardinals before. So he dramatically globalized the College of Cardinals. And of course, it is the College of Cardinals who are now tasked with choosing the next pope. And so that is, again, one of Francis's lasting legacies, is his change to the makeup of the cardinals who will elect a future pope.
It is the beginning of a millennia-old process, one that's recently been updated as well, but not before a period of mourning. CNN Vatican correspondent Christopher Lamb, thank you so much for spending so much time with us and providing all of this incredible and critical insight right now as Catholics around the world wake up to the news that the Holy Father, Pope Francis, dead at 88 years old. We'll let you go so you can continue with your reporting as we now go to CNN senior international correspondent Ben Wiedemann joining us live from Rome. Ben, where you are, what has been the reaction from people that you've spoken to?
Well, the news has just come out, and today, of course, is a holiday. It's the day after Easter, known as Pasquetta here in Italy. And so it's a day that normally people go out to picnics, but Italians who I've spoken to have heard the news are shocked. This was a pope who was very popular among Italians. He was seen in this time when politics is increasingly crude and rude, and so much ugly language is being used. Pope Francis was seen as one of the few world leaders who really just sort of radiated kindness and understanding and hope and simply a positive attitude and concern for the poor and the migrants and the unfortunate. He was seen as somebody who really embodied the kind of values that people ideally would like to see in world leaders. So people are shocked because, of course, yesterday we saw Pope Francis came out in the Pope Mobile, drove around St. Peter's Square, greeted people, said a few words, and then in the evening he met with U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance. Certainly, it was perhaps his busiest day since getting out of the hospital. And for people to wake up this morning and hear the news that he has died at 7:35 a.m. local time, according to the Vatican, is quite a shock. Because certainly during those long weeks when Pope Francis was in Rome's Gemelli Hospital suffering from double pneumonia, there really was sort of this trepidation one could feel in the air that perhaps he would never leave that hospital alive. When he left the hospital, there was a great big sigh of relief from so many people here to see him leave hospital, appear to be recovering. And of course, so this out of the blue for him to die like this. Of course, he was 88. His health was frail, but nonetheless, the assumption was that he was on the road to recovery as much as one can be at 88 with shaky health. Nonetheless, people here are indeed shocked and saddened by the news of the death of Pope Francis, perhaps one of the more popular popes in recent history. Polo?
Ben, where you are in Rome, I'm curious if you could just offer some insight in what you've experienced in the city, and certainly not to make light of it, but this roller coaster of emotions to a certain extent for some of the people there, this anticipation, this concern, and then eventual surprise to see him, as you point out, aboard that Pope-mobile, and then followed by this deep sense of shock and sadness. I mean, just incredible when you reflect on the last 3 days for people where you are, especially those Catholics.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. In February, mid-February, he went into hospital, and a few days later, he was diagnosed with double pneumonia. There really was a feeling that he, given his health, might not make it. And certainly yesterday was Easter, a very important holiday for Italians and Catholics around the world. And today, for Italians, normally it's a day when people go out to the countryside, to the beach, they go on picnics. It's a day sort of to enjoy the spring weather. All that has changed. All those plans perhaps may go out the window for many people who are in a state of shock. Keep in mind that, you know, the Pope lives in Rome. He's a neighbor of people who live in Rome. And oftentimes when there are major events at the Vatican, whether the death of a Pope, the election of a Pope, people just flock to St. Peter's. And certainly I think that's what we can expect today. For the death of somebody, as I said, who was very popular, seen as somebody who had the milk of human kindness flowing in his veins at a time when that seems to be going out of style. The milk in many veins of our leaders has gone sour, and for him to leave at this time of all times is really quite a shock for people. But nonetheless, in a sense, it doesn't come as a complete surprise, given that he's 88. He had part of his right lung removed many years ago. He had mobility problems. He had recurrent lung problems, respiratory problems. So even though people were hoping that he would live longer, I think there's a realization that his health was shaky as it was. But as I said, those Italians I've spoken to were very upset, very saddened to see the passing of such an important figure in their lives. Polo?
No, and I'm so glad you mentioned that. This is a Pope of a life of humility, simplicity, so he lived as a resident among the people in the Vatican, surrounding regions in Rome as well, and I'm so glad that you speak to that as well. So for many, it is more than just losing the head of the Catholic Church. It is losing somebody that they consider to be a fellow resident of the area, I take it.
Yeah, and he was, as you mentioned, he was a humble man. He chose not to live in the very sumptuous apostolic apartments in Vatican City, and he lived in Casa Santa Marta, which is basically a residence, sort of the Vatican Hotel. Very simple. He lived in a small, it's called a suite, but it was really just a couple rooms and that was it. And he would eat his meals in the cafeteria with the staff, the gardening staff, everybody. And he was somebody who, he didn't like all the fancy vestments that the previous popes wore. He drove around in a Fiat 500, not a fancy car. This was a man who was humble. His tastes were humble, but nonetheless, at the same time, he was a man with a real sense of humor. That and sort of he had the common touch. I remember I was in St. Peter's Square when he came out and made his first appearance as Pope, and sort of he ended his words, his address to the crowd with buona cena, have a good dinner in Italian, which is basically sort of a very humble way of saying, you know, have a good Sunday, have a good day. So he was a man who really touched a chord in Italians, in Catholics around the world, as somebody who did not worship wealth and power, somebody who always was concerned with the poor and the downtrodden. And as my friend and colleague Chris was just talking about, when he became Pope, his first visit was to Lampedusa, an island in the Mediterranean, sort of the first point of arrival for migrants who are making that very dangerous, treacherous crossing over the Mediterranean. And you know, the migrants, of course, in this age, in this era, are looked upon as illegal aliens and undocumented. He looked at these people as human beings. And I think that was something that really struck people, is that he had this deep humanity that, as I said, seems to be a scarcer and scarcer quantity these days.
I recall some of our recent reporting too, Ben, when it comes to how he sought to really enlarge the role of women in the Vatican. Even, I recall, if I'm not mistaken, in recent months, even appointing a woman to a very high-profile role within the Vatican. So I think that's also an important point to be made in terms of how he really expanded the horizons of the church.
Yeah, he expanded the horizons of the church in many ways, appointing women to senior positions, which is an absolute first. Keep in mind, the Vatican is really, until Pope Francis, was a men's club. It was a place where, of course, you know, the nuns and whatnot and sisters have a role to play, but it was by and large a supporting role. And he made it clear that he felt that women were equal partners in the operations, in the workings of the church, and he made that clear at every possible occasion. But this was somebody who wanted to include those who traditionally had been excluded from the upper echelons of the Vatican bureaucracy and the church in general. He, as Chris, again, he's the expert, was saying that he did not have a preference for church leaders from Italy. He's, of course, from Italian background, even though he's Argentinian. He was always looking beyond sort of the traditional boundaries of the church hierarchy to Africa, to Asia, to Latin America, to bring in people to hold ever more senior positions within the church. So he certainly was somebody who broke down barriers. And of course, the hope is that this will continue with his successor. Polo?
And Ben, don't go anywhere. Just want to bring our viewers up to speed now, coming up on 10:45 in the morning in Vatican City, where officials there confirming the death of Pope Francis at 88. As we work to learn more, tributes from around the world are coming in, including from French President Emmanuel Macron, paying a tribute to the Holy Father who died on Easter Monday, writing, "From Buenos Aires to Rome, Pope Francis wanted the church to bring joy and hope to the poorest, to unite people with one another and with nature." He goes on to write, "May this hope be resurrected incessantly beyond him to all Catholics, to the grieving world. My wife and I send our thoughts." Again, words from the French President Emmanuel Macron, one of many tributes that are coming in right now, Ben. And I also think it's important to point out how this is a pope that was no stranger to uncomfortable situations. I remember being on the ground, covering him visiting Havana and meeting with government officials there, and basically, to a certain extent, even finger wagging. And that went all the way down to just in recent days, particularly over the weekend, when he met with Vice President J.D. Vance. Of course, the Holy Father, no stranger to criticizing the Donald Trump administration.
Yes, and in fact, the J.D. Vance meeting, which took place yesterday afternoon, Rome time, was apparently very brief, and it was actually his deputy who met with Vance the day before, and apparently gave the U.S. Vice President, who is a convert to Catholicism, something of a lecture on kindness, on compassion, to a man in an administration that many people feel simply is completely devoid of any compassion. So certainly, yes, the Pope has never shied away from expressing opinions that perhaps were contrary to those held elsewhere. For instance, on the question of Gaza, he has been a very strong proponent for an end to the war. He's expressed time and time again concern for the suffering of the people in Gaza. Before he went into hospital, he tried to speak every evening with the priest, the Catholic priest in Gaza, to see how people were, how they were getting by. And this at a time when most leaders will perhaps express concern, but at the same time, they'll turn around and approve arms sales to Israel that allow this war to continue. So he certainly was somebody who was different from so many world leaders, who he walked the walk and talked the talk when it came to his conviction that war is an obscenity. And oftentimes, even when he was in hospital, he would put out statements expressing concern, calling for the end of war in places that, for instance, the mainstream media simply ignores, like the Congo. He certainly never dropped the ball when it came to looking at the world as a global family, as opposed to sort of tribes with flags, as one might describe the world scene at the moment. So he certainly was distinct in that regard. He never shied away from calling a spade, of criticizing those he felt who simply had lost their humanity and were simply pursuing paths of violence and warfare and oppression that he simply rejected outright. And he never shied away from saying that.
And staying on Vice President J.D. Vance regarding Pope Francis, we understand that he just at least issued a statement, or at least released some remarks. The Vice President saying, "I just learned of the passing of Pope Francis. My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him." And then he goes on to write that he was happy to see the Pope just yesterday, as you just point out, Ben. Also, the Vice President writing that though he was obviously very ill. So the Vice President's observation there made public during his moments with the Holy Father in that meeting that perhaps many people expected not to happen. And then we see him sitting there in front of the Vice President and having that conversation as well. We are also getting other reaction from around the world, with Spain Prime Minister Sanchez hailing Pope Francis as a commitment, being somebody deeply committed to the most vulnerable. Ben, you are in Rome. As you pointed out earlier, it is a holiday. So a lot of people certainly not working today. If you could just set the scene for what it's going to be like today, and certainly in the weeks to come during this period of mourning for people there in Rome and specifically in the Vatican.
Well, today began like a very nice early spring day, and I think people were making plans to go to the beach, go picnics, and I think now the atmosphere is clearly changed. I think a lot of people are going to change those plans and go to St. Peter's Square just to express perhaps their condolences, to be in an important place at an important time. And I think what we're going to see is that the normal rhythm of this very busy city is going to change in the coming days and perhaps weeks as we prepare for the funeral and then, of course, the conclave to choose to elect the next pope. So this is not going to be a couple days of mourning and that's it. This is going to be weeks of what we've seen before. I mean, I was here for the death of John Paul II, the resignation of Benedict XVI, and it really is sort of a long process that will begin. And certainly it begins today with profound sadness for many people, and it will end after the conclave when we see the white smoke coming from the Vatican. We will see who the new Pope is. I'm not going to delve into who the possible candidates are. I think it's a little premature for that kind of speculation. But this is a process through which Rome has been many times before over the centuries, so it's not an unfamiliar process. But every time a pope dies, it really sort of has an impact on people that goes beyond sort of your normal political leaders, because this man is not just a prominent figure in Rome itself, but he is the leader of the Roman Catholic Church. So certainly I think Rome's going to be busy, and we're going to be busy for the coming weeks. Polo?
Indeed, and I hate to take more of your time, Ben, but I wonder if you could just in the last few moments here tell us a little bit more about what we do know about the circumstances of Pope Francis's death, obviously taking into consideration at his advanced age and also in his delicate state of health. What have Vatican officials confirmed about the circumstances of the Pope's death?
Well, they did put out a statement this morning, and I'll just read it. At 7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of his father. His whole life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his church. So basically, 7:35, Pope Francis passed away. They haven't given any details as to why, but I think it's not too difficult to understand why. He spent weeks and weeks in Rome's Gemelli Hospital suffering from double pneumonia. And since then, he came out, and the doctors, when he left the hospital, suggested that he rest, that he not exert himself. But Pope Francis was well known as a very headstrong individual. When he wanted to do something, he's the Pope. You can't tell him no. And I think what we've seen, certainly with the amount of activity he's been engaged in since leaving the hospital, is that he continued to insist on carrying on with a full schedule. Yesterday, he drove around St. Peter's Square in a Pope mobile. He addressed the faithful. He met with J.D. Vance. Clearly, he thought he was regaining his strength. But as I said, a man 88 years old with a long history of health complications, this is what it is. 7:35 this morning, according to the Vatican, Pope Francis passed away.
Yeah, certainly not a surprise to Catholics around the world. Nonetheless, painful and shocking for so many because of what he contributed during his time for well over a decade as the head of the Catholic Church, as Catholics around the world now waking up to news that Pope Francis has died. According to Vatican officials, he was 88 years old. This now essentially starting that period between the death of the Pope and the election of another, which essentially started, as Ben points out, in the 7 o'clock hour local time when his death was confirmed. Cardinals will now have to decide when that funeral can take place, and after that, when that conclave can begin. But as Ben points out, we are still weeks and weeks away from that. At this point, the focus certainly is on what we know about the death of Pope Francis and the reaction for Catholics all around the world. Ben, you are in Rome this morning. You mentioned what will certainly be this seismic shift in the mood after celebrating Easter weekend to now preparing to say farewell eventually to Pope Francis when the funeral begins, which again, we're waiting for those details as well. Would you like to share a little bit more about what people there, the immediate reaction that you've been getting from people in Rome after they got word of the Holy Father's passing?
Well, the immediate reaction, I'll tell you, was from my wife, who is Italian. And I was the one who informed her because I was informed by CNN of the death. And she, just gasped because she, like so many other people here, was a great admirer of the Pope. And as I made my way to the CNN bureau here, I could see people on their phone, and I could hear people talking about the death of the Pope. And this is the sort of thing that I'm sure that there are very few people at this point, at this time of the morning in Rome on a holiday, who are unaware that the Pope has passed away. And as I said, it leaves a big hole because this was a pope who was popular. You know, not all popes are popular. Some popes, I'm not going to mention who, were seen as dour and sort of distant, but this was a pope who spoke the language of the people. He was from Argentina, but of Italian origin, and his preferred language of discourse in public was always Italian. Italian with a bit of an Argentinian accent, but Italian nonetheless. And he really struck a chord with people that I think previous popes didn't necessarily do that. And so I think people are going to feel his loss profoundly. And as I said, you know, Italian politics, like politics elsewhere at the moment, is very rough and nasty, and some of the sort of the vocabulary being used, people find crude and unpleasant. Pope Francis was somebody who spoke softly, who spoke with words of kindness and compassion. And he was somebody so many people here admired for those very reasons. And as I said before, he was somebody who expressed concern at times when others were talking realpolitik about things like Gaza, Ukraine. He was concerned about the people, not politics, not power, not leaders, not presidents, not prime ministers. He was concerned about the people. So I think his passing really will leave a void, perhaps filled by his successor, perhaps not. We don't know at this point, but it leaves a void that people, not just here in Italy, Rome, but well beyond, throughout not only the Catholic world. For instance, I spend a lot of time in the Middle East. Many Muslims looked at him as a positive figure on the world scene, somebody who expressed concern about the suffering of all people, not just Christians, all people. And so I think his passing really does leave an empty space that will be hard to fill. Polo?
Pope Francis's reach, as you point out, certainly knew no limits. That is Ben Wiedemann, CNN senior international correspondent in Rome, gathering the latest. Ben, thank you so much for spending so much time with us and sharing all that valuable insight. You've been there along the way, covering this papacy that now ends with his death, again, at 88 years old. Ben, thank you. The Italian Prime Minister as well, responding and reacting to Pope Francis's death, issuing a statement just moments ago. The Prime Minister writing, "I had the privilege of enjoying his friendship, his advice, his teachings, which never ceased, not even during times of trial and suffering. We say goodbye to the Holy Father with a heart full of sadness." Again, that statement coming from the Italian Prime Minister just hours after Vatican officials confirmed the death of Pope Francis, dead at 88.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Good morning to our viewers watching in the U.S. and around the world. I'm Polo Sandoval in New York, where we are following breaking news. Pope Francis, the 266th head of the Roman Catholic Church, has died at 88 years old. The Vatican made the announcement just over an hour ago, saying in a statement that the Pope passed away at 7:35 a.m. local time in the Vatican. And this comes just weeks after he was discharged from a hospital in Rome, where he was treated for double pneumonia. And then just yesterday, Pope Francis gave the traditional Easter blessing from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, addressing a massive crowd of faithful worshipers in what was his highest profile appearance since he left the hospital. So many people were skeptical, not even sure if he would appear. Well, he also held a brief meeting on Sunday with the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, turned out to be the last U.S. dignitary that the Pope would meet with. Francis became the first Latin American Pope in 2013, and he was one of the oldest popes in the Church's history. Throughout his papacy, Pope Francis was a vocal champion for the poor, for migrants, and also for the environment. And also in part of the Vatican statement announcing his passing, Cardinal Kevin Farrell said, quote, "He taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage, and universal love, especially in favor of the poorest and most marginalized." Again, the Vatican announcing the passing of Pope Francis at 88. CNN's Vatican correspondent Christopher Lamb taking a look back at the Pope's life and his legacy.
Buonasera.
A simple good evening from the newly elected Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio from Argentina, the first Pope ever from the Americas. His choice of the name Francis, after the saint known for his poverty and love of nature, had never been used before by a pope, set the tone for a pontificate marked by attention to the poor and a simple way of life. This pope's home would no longer be the historic apartments, but a simple set of rooms in a guest house on the Vatican grounds. Elaborate papal robes and jewellery remained in the closet, as Francis wore only his white cassock, black orthopaedic shoes with a simple pectoral cross. And when he needed his glasses fixed, he hopped in a car and went himself to the optician in Rome. A down-to-earth style learned on the streets of Buenos Aires. The one-time nightclub bouncer took public transportation and always remained a fan of Argentina's San Lorenzo soccer team. His simple words, too, had a way of getting to the heart of divisive issues.
If
a person is gay and accepts the Lord and has goodwill, well, who am I to judge?
It didn't change the Catholic Church's opposition to gay marriage, but convinced many that he was a pope open to change. He was a champion of the environment, issuing an encyclical, the highest papal teaching document, to warn of the dangers of global warming and a throwaway consumer culture in the West that damages our climate and the livelihood of the poor.
The misuse and destruction of the environment are also accompanied by a relentless process of exclusion. In effect, a selfish and boundless thirst for power and material prosperity leads both to the misuse of available natural resources and to the exclusion of the weak.
He drove home the point travelling to the United States, home of gas-guzzling SUVs, in a tiny Fiat. Equally at home with the poor and powerful, on the lawn of the White House, he made a plea for immigrants.
As the son of an immigrant family, I'm happy to be a guest in this country, which was largely built by such families.
And at a time marked by a dramatic refugee crisis in Europe, Francis tirelessly called on governments and people to not close their eyes or their borders. And he walked his talk, bringing back 12 Syrian refugees on his plane following a trip to the Greek island of Lesbos. In the difficult terrain of the Holy Land, Pope Francis prayed at the wall dividing Palestinian West Bank from Jerusalem and embraced his Jewish friends in front of the Wailing Wall. The Pope focused much of his attention to those on the peripheries, as he called it, the outsiders, excluded from society.
The hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, those in prison.
He sought to support the churches on those peripheries and far from Rome. The longest foreign trip of his pontificate saw him travel across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, highlighting the importance of this region for the future of the Catholic Church. Going to those on the margins was something Francis himself practiced during many moments of his pontificate. Embracing the disabled, washing the feet of prisoners, installing shower rooms for the homeless around the Vatican.
One of his characteristics, a characteristic of his entire life, was humility.
A humility that attracted the world, with politicians and stars lining up to meet him at the Vatican. He was not so popular at times inside the Vatican and among powerful Catholic groups in the United States. There was a backlash from conservatives upset about his insistence that church teaching must develop, along with his biting critiques of clerical culture. His financial reforms seeking greater transparency faced significant difficulties, and the scandal of sex abuse continuing to be the Catholic Church's biggest struggle. In the case of Chile, Francis admitted in a letter that he too was part of the problem when every bishop in the country offered to resign in the wake of sexual abuse scandals there. Also accused of being part of the problem by his ex-ambassador to the United States, who claimed he told Francis about sexual abuse allegations against former Washington, D.C. Cardinal Theodore McCarrick 5 years before, and Francis allowed him to continue serving.
I will not say one more word on this.
Francis eventually defrocked the US cardinal and held an unprecedented global meeting of bishops to address the issue. A Vatican investigation later called into question the claims made by the former ambassador, who was then barred from receiving communion and put into exile by the Church after he rejected the authority of the Pope and some key Catholic teachings. Nevertheless, questions remained about Francis's handling of the abuse crisis.
There is no doubt that the child sexual abuse scandals are the central stain on his legacy. I mean, over and over again, Pope Francis said the right things. He met with victims. He expressed heartfelt sorrow. He expressed resolve to get this right. But, you know, most critics, many victims, would say that that wasn't matched with a policy follow-through.
When the coronavirus pandemic hit in 2020, the image of the Pope blessing the world from an empty St. Peter's Square became a symbol for that desolate time. Francis urged nations to share their vaccines with poorer countries and vaccinated hundreds of homeless and underprivileged at the Vatican. The following year, during an historic trip to Iraq, the first Pope ever to visit the country, Francis stood on top of the rubble in Mosul, once an ISIS stronghold, and furthered his outreach to the Muslim world by an unprecedented meeting with top Shia Muslim cleric, the reclusive Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani. From the beginning of the war in Ukraine in 2022, Francis was an outspoken advocate for peace. He avoided outright condemnation of Vladimir Putin, but publicly appealed to the Russian president, begging him to stop for the love of his people, the Pope said. Francis spoke several times by phone with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky during 2022, asking him to be open to serious peace proposals, before the pair met face-to-face at the Vatican in May of 2023 and October 2024. He made similar appeals for peace during the conflict in the Middle East, saying that the Israel-Hamas war had descended into terrorism. He insisted that war is always a defeat, and said self-defense that is not proportional is immoral. Francis' most important message was one of fraternity, that we are all brothers and sisters, despite our differences. Take care of the earth and each other, he said, and don't forget to pray for me.
And just in the last few moments, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, who had just met with Pope Francis over the weekend, on X actually issuing a statement. I'll read you a portion of that. The Vice President writing, "I just learned of the passing of Pope Francis. My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him. I was happy to see him yesterday, though he was obviously very ill, but I'll always remember him for the below homily that he gave in the very early days of COVID. It was really quite beautiful. May God rest his soul." And then he attaches that. Again, that's the Vice President who had just met with the Holy Father at the Vatican the day before the confirmation of his death. Now, let's get more analysis and more reporting now from Elise Ellen. She's a senior correspondent for Crux, which covers the Vatican and the Catholic Church. Elise is in Rome. Elise, good morning to you on what is already extremely busy and extremely eventful and shocking morning for Catholics around the world. What are you hearing from those there at the Vatican about the death of Pope Francis?
Oh, good morning. I think the word that you said sums it up most aptly, shocking. This morning, everyone woke up with the joy of Easter still very much being felt. In Rome, you know, the day after Easter, Pasquetta is still a holiday. Most people spend this day in celebration with their family and their friends. So this was quite shocking for most people here in Rome this morning, especially after Pope Francis's sort of triumphant outing yesterday. He appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's, gave the traditional noontime Easter blessing, and it was his first time going out and driving around the crowds, So, even though he was frail, even though he was still obviously sick and struggling, I don't think anybody expected it. He was quite at the point of death. It was seen as sort of a triumphant moment for Pope Francis after his very long hospitalization just, a month ago. So the word, I think, right now is shock. People are in shock. They're still absorbing the news and trying to wrap their heads around, the fact that such a big personality is no longer with us.
And not only as a journalist, but also as a Catholic myself, I'll have to tell you, I'm struck by just the last few days and what we've seen from Pope Francis. There was so much uncertainty, so many questions about whether or not we would even see him make a public appearance. And then he begins the Easter weekend by visiting that prison, praying with those inmates, however, unable to participate in the traditional washing of the feet, and then makes his way to Easter Vigil as well. And then on Sunday, we see him aboard that Pope Mobile in a very iconic scene. Just walk me through what it's been like the last 3 days for people there in Rome from your perspective and what you've seen.
You know, the last few days, obviously, there's always a lot of excitement here, you know, in anticipation for Holy Week. It's the most sacred week on the Catholic Church's calendar. Easter is the most sacred liturgy. So there was a lot of excitement because, you know, in the days ahead, you know, Pope Francis, after he got out of the hospital, he was discharged on March 23rd after having spent 38 days in the hospital fighting double pneumonia. And, you know, it's under doctor's orders to observe a strict 2-month convalescence, you know, a time of rest without going out, without meeting groups. And Pope Francis, as he often, you know, has, you know, as he often did, you know, throughout his papacy, sort of, you know, took that with a grain of salt. We started seeing him appear, you know, his first public appearance after his hospitalization was April 6th. And we've been seeing him, you know, with increased frequency since then. So there was a lot of anticipation over the last week about, are we going to see the Pope or not, you know, and excitement over the fact that it was very much assumed that, you know, for Catholics and for everybody here in Rome, that they would see him on Easter. So there was a lot of excitement, a lot of buzz around the papal liturgies. You know, even though they were celebrated by aides, you know, Pope Francis did make himself known. He popped out, you know, in the Basilica on Saturday prior to the big Easter vigil. He was not able to celebrate that himself, but he made a surprise outing and blessed some pilgrims. He had a moment of prayer. He was giving candy to children. And there was just a lot of excitement on Easter too. People knew they were going to see Pope Francis. And I think that's the most comforting thing. People felt comforted because after such a long hospitalization and such a serious ordeal that he had been through, to see him there, you know, as leader of the church, implying that at least in that moment he was still with us, was something very special. I think it was a very special, you know, celebration for a lot of people, which makes today's news so much more difficult.
Yeah, so many people likely to see that as a farewell gift, that last appearance. At least you cover the church. You speak to not only the faithful, but to church officials as well, and fully appreciating what will be a long process, a mourning process before we reach conclave. Just from your perspective, what will the church need next as it turns the page and looks for its next leader when that time comes?
Well, that is a big and complicated question. I think that's one that every cardinal is asking themselves in this moment. You know, inevitably, the church is mourning right now, but that question inevitably is being asked. It has to be asked, you know, by the cardinals who are going to elect Pope Francis's successor. And I think the overwhelming consensus, you know, it usually comes down to two things. I mean, it comes down to basically what do you want as individuals, you know? So everyone's answer to what comes next is going to be a little different. But it basically comes down to the question of, do you want continuity or discontinuity with the papacy that has just ended? Do they have a sense, the cardinals, that things were going in the right direction, that the church was doing well under his leadership? Or do they want to shift things and do something a little differently? And I think that there are going to be mixed reactions to that. Francis was a big personality. He was beloved by many, but he was also quite controversial for many as well. And so the cardinals are going to have to ask themselves what went well in this papacy and what didn't, and who's going to be a candidate that's apt to continue some of the things that Francis was loved for, you know, his embracing of the poor and the marginalized, you know, his push for justice and his emphasis on God's mercy, you know, but who can possibly also, you know, maybe do some damage control for the things that Francis was also controversial for. You know, he faced a lot of questions over, you know, doctrinal obscurity sometimes. People didn't think he was clear enough when it came down on that. You know, his efforts to reform and the church's pastoral approach oftentimes came under scrutiny. And so you're going to, you know, the cardinals are going to have to ask themselves, who's going to be able to, you know, perhaps smooth over the wrinkles that were created by Francis with some of you know, his decisions, but also continue the legacy that, you know, the church and the world responded so positively to. So it's not an easy task, and it's something I imagine every single one of them are going to be thinking very carefully about over the next 10 days or so before we get into discussion about a conclave.
Those are all critical questions that no doubt that these cardinals had been asking themselves, I'm sure, not only given the conversations and the talk about possible resignation, but certainly because of the Holy Father's very delicate health state. Elise, Alan, thank you so much for your reporting. We'll let you go on what is undoubtedly a critical day for you there in Rome and at the Vatican as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
CNN Vatican correspondent Christopher Lamb joins us now live with more. He's outside of St. Peter's Square. Christopher, you've been there speaking to the faithful. What are some of the what's some of the immediate reaction you're getting from people there?
Well, the reaction to the death of Pope Francis is coming in. There's taking time, I think, for people to process this news. There's obviously a lot of sadness because Pope Francis was an enormously popular pontiff. He was the people's pope who connected with so many different types of groups, of individuals, particularly the poorest, the refugees, migrants, those on the margins of society. And just yesterday on Sunday, Easter Sunday, he was out in the square of St. Peter's for the last time on the Pope Mobile, greeting people, and clearly then it was obvious that people loved this Pope. He delighted the crowds with his decision to come out to see them. It was obviously very difficult for Francis yesterday because he didn't seem well. He wasn't engaged in the normal way that he has been when we've seen him out in the crowds in previous times. But it was a mark of this Pope that he wanted to serve right until the end. There were some who speculated that Francis might resign when he was hospitalized for that 38-day period with double pneumonia. People thought he might decide to step down. That clearly wasn't his thinking. He wanted to go with his boots on. And he was even over the Easter weekend trying to participate in services as best he could. He obviously couldn't lead those services, but he came out onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica for that one last time, the same balcony that he appeared for the first time when he was elected as Pope. The first Pope to call himself after St. Francis of Assisi, the saint who, of course, devoted himself to poverty, to care for creation, for dialogue with other faiths. All of these things were really important to Pope Francis. He took that inspiration from St. Francis of Assisi. He was also an outsider pope. He was the first pope in over 100 years to never have lived or studied in Rome before his election. That meant he was something of a disruptor. He shook up the church establishment. He refused to be scripted by the Vatican bureaucracy. He was his own man, and he was very clear that the church, the Catholic Church, needed to focus on the essentials of the Christian message. That is serving the poorest. He said he wanted a church for the poor, a poor church for the poor, going out to the margins, solidarity with migrants. He wanted to dialogue with other faiths. He built bridges with other religions, particularly those from the Muslim world. He had a sort of an unprecedented collaboration with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, and he also had a meeting with the Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani in Iraq. So the Shia and Sunni leaders he met and got to know from the Muslim world. He was a tireless advocate for peace, repeatedly calling for peace in Ukraine and the Middle East. He tried to do his best to mediate in those conflicts. He really was a pope who gave everything during his just over 12-year pontificate. He's also sought to institute reforms in the Catholic Church, some of them not always received well. He wanted a church, particularly a church leadership, that was doing more to listen to ordinary Catholics, that was less disconnected from the needs of the people in the pews. And he also made some very important and significant steps when it came to welcoming gay Catholics, LGBTQ plus Catholics. He was the Pope who famously said, "Who am I to judge?" when it came to gay priests, and he offered blessings for same-sex couples. Now, people didn't all like that in the Catholic Church. They found that disturbing and disruptive. But Francis realized and he saw the need to communicate a message to not just those in the church, but to those outside of the church. Francis had a strong moral standing, not just among Catholics, but amongst all Christians, all different groups of Christians and different religious faiths. So Francis is a pope who has profoundly shaped the Catholic Church. He is also someone who has reformed the papacy. I mentioned St. Francis of Assisi and the importance of poverty. Francis took the decision not to live in the apostolic palace behind me here in St. Peter's, but to go and live in a guest house at the Santa Marta, which is where the news of his death was announced this morning. He decided to live in a more simple way, but also he lived in the Santa Marta guest house because it gave him access to people. The Santa Marta is a place where bishops and cardinals, other people would come through to stay on when they were coming to Rome for church business. He got a chance to meet people. There was a communal dining room in the Santa Marta where the Pope was seen having his meals. So people could, certainly in the early days, put down their tray with their food and sit next to the Pope and talk to him. There was an accessibility to Francis that we hadn't seen before. Now, I met the Pope on a number of occasions. I travelled with him several times, and I was always struck by how much of a good sense of humour he had. He would frequently joke with journalists and reporters, how comfortable he was in his own skin, and how much of a kind of clear-eyed leader he was of the church. He wasn't looking to simply appease and please those at the top level of the church, but to try and take the message of the church, of Christianity, out to as many people as possible. He was very much an evangelizing Pope. So really, I think people here in St. Peter's Square, as they come to terms with this news, will feel a sense of profound sadness for a people's Pope who was hugely popular and very much loved.
A beacon of compassion, humility, and spiritual courage. Those are the words from the Indian Prime Minister for Pope Francis, a tribute for the Holy Father. Christopher Lamb, thank you very much as you report there from the very same square where Pope Francis was just yesterday before his death was confirmed this morning. We're joined now by Kaya Burgess. She's a religious affairs correspondent for The Times, joining us live now from London. Curious if you could tell us what you're hearing from your sources, certainly given his fragile state, not surprising, but what do we know about the circumstances of the Holy Father's death?
Well, I mean, very little at the moment beyond what was said this morning. We know that obviously he's been ill for a long time, and we also know that he was able to make appearances over Easter weekend. And so, you know, he managed to sort of hold on, I suppose, for Easter, which is clearly the central date in the Christian calendar. We still haven't actually heard the exact circumstances of exactly sort of how he passed away, what the sort of final kind of cause of death was at the moment, but I'm sure that will come.
What do we know about what we can expect in the coming days, especially from Vatican officials? Obviously, this is going to start this triggers a millennia-old process and tradition.
Well, the first step, of course, will be preparing for the funeral, which will take place, you know, fairly soon, and give a chance for there to be some sort of lying in state for people to probably pass by and sort of see the Pope. But also the preparations will be going on to get a huge number of cardinals gathered from around the world. All those under the age of 80 are eligible to vote in the conclave. And so the preparations will start taking place in more of a matter of kind of weeks, that will be, to gather them in the Sistine Chapel for the debates and for the vote, which all take place behind closed doors. From the outside, all we see of that, of course, is puffs of smoke from the chimney, which tell us whether a new pope has or has not been named. But the Carmelengo, who's former Bishop of Dallas, Cardinal Kevin Farrell, who was born in Dublin, he was the man who announced the Pope's death this morning, and it's his job now to undertake the preparations for and then the management of the conclave to elect a successor.
A monumental task ahead. Kaya, finally, if you could just speak to the timing of all of this. It is, and you touched on it briefly, just the remarkable nature of the timing, that he went out working. Now, he made very clear here that he did not want to stop up until the very end. His doctors had recommended that he take 2 months' time to rest and to at least limit those public appearances, and he did. But nonetheless, he was determined, so much so that as we see these pictures, as you and I speak, seeing him aboard that Pope-mobile, how does that speak to his determination to essentially work until the very end, to serve until the very end, I should say?
Well, it's a good question, because when Pope Benedict stepped down, people wondered whether that might set a precedent, in that popes have traditionally worked until they pass away in the job, and that Francis had maybe hinted earlier on in his papacy that perhaps if he got to a stage where his health was failing him and he didn't feel able to kind of carry out the duties of Pope, that perhaps he too might follow, and it might become a new standard even, potentially. But clearly in the last few years, when his health has been failing, he's had to miss various services. His breathing issues have meant he's had to ask other people to read his sermons or speeches for him in various situations. He has shown no sign. And it's clear he has felt that the job is something that he wants to continue until the very end. Perhaps he wants to do more to secure his legacy. It's been a very busy time. I think he's wanted to push through some of his reforms in the church to do with, having synods to govern things, and perhaps he was thinking about the future as well. And his legacy, of course, will, as to what his legacy will be, that will be cemented to a degree by who follows him. Will it be someone like-minded who'll carry on his sort of attitude and his direction, or someone who'll want to reverse it? And so he's been appointing sort of like-minded people to join the College of Cardinals. So he obviously just felt like his work was ongoing, and it wasn't something he wanted to give up at any point, and keep on going for as long as he could.
Now, you pose some very important questions, but for now, it's about mourning, certainly. But nonetheless, those questions that you raise, I'm sure that those cardinals have been at least asking themselves some of that because of what had been Pope Francis's health. Thank you so much for your time, Kay. I really appreciate you, religious affairs correspondent for the Times. Stay with us, much more breaking news after the break as we continue to follow developments out of the Vatican, where officials have confirmed the death of Pope Francis at 88.
Visionaries in association with Hyundai.
Emma's journey to one of the most coveted positions in football, manager of the iconic Olympic gold medal winning US women's national team, began simply with a love of the game.
And what was it about football that drew you to it as a game, but equally that you saw had such an ability to do more than just be a game?
I just don't know anything else. My mum was asked this the other day when someone said, when did Emma start playing? And she said the minute she came out of my womb. I was the kid that would come home from school, drop my school bag, run down to the pitch, play till 10 o'clock at night, stop for dinner. My dad has always been at the heart of that. I think watching a lot of Football Italia, all of those things, I couldn't imagine a life without football. I just couldn't.
Nothing is handed to you in the women's game.
4 times Women's Czech Footballer of the Year.
I want to help women's football grow. To show women can be involved in all aspects of the game. With Hyundai supporting the Women's World Cup, I hope to see more women playing. And more young girls dreaming big. Because when we raise the bar, we inspire the future.
It is a busy news day all around the world.
This is One World.
The world's top headlines with some of the world's biggest players.
Stories that captivate from 2 unique perspectives. Zain Asher and Biana Golodriga use their extensive experience to cover global news with passion and intellect.
Walk us through what specifically Secretary of State Marco Rubio was talking about. What leverage, if any, does Prime Minister Netanyahu have at this point?
One World with Zain Asher and Biana Golodriga. Today on CNN.
Discover the land of the rising sun, from the vibrant streets of Tokyo to the enchanting landscapes. Come explore Japan with CNN.
Yay, my first friendship bracelet.
And experience the best of this rich nation.
A desire to create timeless beauty everywhere.
Appreciate the opportunity to sit down with you.
An epic adventure to Japan's remote corners.
Kanpai.
CNN World Sport.
Non-stop action year-round.
I have a lot of things to give to the football.
All the major events.
I love where the game is going right now.
What does it take for me to be even better?
And tournaments.
The emotions sometimes are impossible to control.
The latest highlights.
Women's sport is having a moment that it should have always had.
And exclusive interviews with your favorite coaches and players.
We're going to keep this thing rolling.
You rock. Don't miss CNN
World Sport, only on CNN.
He could do street photography, he could do portrait photography. He was an incredible commercial photographer. When I discovered that Yoko had continued to visit him even after their divorce and even after he was in the hospital, I was struck just by the sheer romanticism of that. When I started thinking about what a movie might look like, it was 3 books in particular. It was Raven's Yoko and another book called Family. And those 3 books in particular became the backbone for how I constructed the movie. And then I was searching Japanese culture for something that was relevant, and I discovered Tengu, and then discovered Tsukiyomi, like this god of the moon, who's a raven. I just thought, wow. And then it just gave me a vehicle then for Cassie to start talking. He's sometimes talking to himself, or I think we all have our own raven on our shoulder, just yakking in our ear.
The 5 Things Podcast from CNN. Get the day's top 5 stories, all in one podcast. The 5 things you need to hear in under 5 minutes. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Mike Valerio in Seoul, South Korea, and this is CNN.
And welcome back to breaking news coverage of the death of Pope Francis. I'm Polo Sandoval in New York. For more continuing coverage, I want to bring in my colleague now, Adi Cornish, who's standing by in Washington as we continue to cover the death of Pope Francis. Adi?
Thank you so much, Polo. Pope Francis, of course, the 266th head of the Roman Catholic Church, has died at age 88. The Vatican says he passed away at 7:35 local time this morning, with a statement reading in part, "His whole life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his church." His passing comes just a day after Easter Sunday, where the Pope gave the traditional Easter blessing from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, delighting crowds of worshipers. It was his most high-profile appearance since being released from a Rome hospital almost a month ago, where the Pope spent weeks receiving treatment for double pneumonia. Francis became the first Latin American pope in 2013 and was one of the oldest popes in the Church's history. Now, throughout his papacy, he was a vocal champion for the poor, for migrants, and for the environment. In the Vatican statement, Cardinal Kevin Farrell said, quote, "He taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage, and universal love, especially in favor of the poorest and the most marginalized." CNN Vatican correspondent Christopher Lamb joins us here with more. He's actually now just outside St. Peter's Square. And Chris, can you just start with the gathering? I'm sure more and more people, as they're hearing, are appearing in the square.
Well, that's right. People are gathering in St. Peter's Square at the moment. There's, of course, it's a Jubilee year in Rome and many people are visiting. The news is beginning to filter through to people, and it is news that is being greeted with sadness because, of course, Pope Francis was a hugely popular pope. He was the people's pope who connected with so many different groups, particularly those on the margins of society, the migrants, refugees, the poorest people, the homeless. I mean, just where I'm sitting here, there are a number of homeless who gather each day, and Francis set up facilities to help those homeless who are sleeping rough. Now, Francis was a pope who tried to put into action the values of the Christian message. So, as I said, the importance of service, but also humility and poverty. He took the name Saint Francis of Assisi, a saint who was devoted to those values, and he himself, Francis, lived a very simple lifestyle. He did not live in the apostolic palace behind me, but in the Santa Marta guest house, a place for people who wanted to visit Rome on church business. a place where he originally stayed as Cardinal Bergoglio before he was elected Pope Francis. He stayed in the Santa Marta and remained there. And he decided to not live in the palace, but in the simple guest house, because he also wanted to have access to people. It was very important that he could meet and talk to people and be a very accessible Pope. And just yesterday, Easter Sunday, Francis was out on the Pope-mobile greeting the crowds, despite clearly suffering from the effects of this double pneumonia. He wasn't his usual self yesterday. It was clear he wasn't engaged, particularly in the crowds, as he usually is. Now, Francis, as we know, was the first Pope from Latin America. He was very much an outsider figure. He had not studied or lived in Rome before his election, and that meant he shook up the Church and the Vatican establishment. He refused to be scripted by the Roman Curia, the Church's central administration. He's very much his own man. You know, his first trip outside of Rome was to Lampedusa, the island in southern Italy where migrants were coming in from North Africa, risking their lives and dying in the process. And the Pope decided he would go to Lampedusa as his first visit. And it was said that the Pope had called Alitalia Airways to book a ticket for himself on the plane. And when Alitalia heard that someone called Jorge Bergoglio was trying to book a ticket, they called the Vatican and said, hang on, what's going on here? And in the end, the Vatican had to organize an official trip. But he had that sort of restlessness, that desire, that determination to serve, to break convention. He didn't always follow protocol. He was a Pope of surprises. You know, when he announced the names of new cardinals, he wouldn't tell the cardinals, he wouldn't tell anyone. He would announce them from behind me at the Vatican in the Apostolic Palace. And he'd often choose cardinals who were not the obvious candidates. He chose bishops who were serving in places like Tonga or Haiti or the Central African Republic or Mongolia, places that had never had cardinals before. He thoroughly reformed the College of Cardinals, the body who will be tasked with electing his successor. He internationalized it, and he took away the ecclesiastical career ladder that meant that if you were appointed as an archbishop to a certain diocese or church, you would then automatically become a cardinal. And now Francis changed all that. He shook things up in that respect. And that did see him face quite a lot of opposition. He was, of course, a pope who was very pastoral and compassionate. He shifted the Catholic Church's approach when it came to same-sex relationships and LGBTQ+ Catholics. He offered blessings to gay couples. He famously said, "Who am I to judge?" when asked about a gay priest. He shifted the approach. He didn't change the fundamental doctrines or teachings, but he demanded a more pastoral strategy or pastoral approach. He insisted that people who are gay are children of God and should be included and welcomed. And he insisted time and again that the church is open to everyone. Todos, 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 he said at World Youth Day in Portugal, where a huge gathering of young people. He said the church is open to everyone. And that was really his message, a pope of the people, for the people. And I think there's a lot of sadness here in the square as the news of Francis's death announced this morning by Cardinal Kevin Farrell, the Irish-born US naturalized citizen who is a cardinal in Rome, the former Bishop of Dallas. He announced the news this morning that Pope Francis has died.
Chris, thanks so much. And we have some more news now, which is that the White House has done a social media post saying, "Rest in peace, Pope Francis," with the image there, of course, of both the president and J.D. Vance, who is Catholic, meeting with the Pope. I'm joined now by Kim Daniels. We're bringing her in because she's the director of the Georgetown Initiative on Catholic and Social Thought. First of all, thank you for joining us on this morning. I think it's a sad day for so many people in the world. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was, how significant it was for him to be named Pope in the first place?
Just a remarkable moment. I was there in St. Peter's Square when Pope Francis was named Pope, and I just can't tell you the feeling. It's in many ways parallel to the feeling I have now, and I know so many Catholics. It was so hopeful, so forward-looking, and just a moment of real joy as we welcomed this Pope who had chosen the name Francis a man of peace, a man of rebuilding the church, a man who was forward-looking, and he really had a heart for the poor. St. Francis did, and of course we saw that with Pope Francis throughout his papacy. I think the feeling that Catholics have right now, of course, is one of mourning the death of Pope Francis, who was just such a remarkable leader at this moment in time. And also, again, one of hope that again, on Easter Monday, Pope Francis, he went out giving a blessing to all yesterday on Easter Sunday, the holiest day of the year for us. And really a forward-looking church that is there for the poor and vulnerable, a church of mercy and accompaniment.
When he took over, he said he would approach the Catholic Church more like a field hospital. Can you talk about what he meant by that and how that played out?
That was exactly the theme, I think, that we saw throughout his church, his papacy, that it was a field hospital church that went out to the margins. So he said, it's not about sort of staying enclosed inside the walls of the church. That would be a sick church, he said, if we just stayed within our doors. But it was more like a field hospital after a battle. We were called to go forth to heal wounds first, and then discuss doctrine, and then discuss harder issues, right? But the first thing is to heal people's wounds. And I think that's what you saw with Pope Francis in his travels going around the world to the places that had been forgotten, in his outreach to people who were marginalized, who were poor, who were, as he said, lying wounded by the roadside, like in the story of the Good Samaritan, a parable that was so close to his heart and that he recalled us to time and time again.
He also approached the issue of corruption in the Catholic Church. Can you talk about what that meant in reality, how he affected how it was run?
Sure. I think Pope Francis, really, his legacy is one of both spiritual renewal and structural reform, offering this dynamic, hopeful vision that I've talked about. And of course, there are many challenges in the church, right? And you point out some of them. He his efforts have been to implement significant structural reforms in the church to make it more responsive and more effective in its mission. And in doing that, responding to corruption, responding to the clergy sexual abuse crisis, and in many ways advancing Vatican II, Vatican Council II's vision through reform. Obviously made many steps forward here, but also so much left to do at the same time.
As we mentioned, your Georgetown initiative focuses on Catholic social thought. He was very much a political pope in a way, very right until the last minute. We saw him in a photo with Vice President J.D. Vance, right, who had spoken, making some interpretations about theology. Can you talk about his legacy in that respect, what you're going to be thinking about over the next few days?
I think I would say, first of all, yesterday, the way he approached J.D. Vance, frankly, was as a pastor, right? He gave him gifts for his children, Easter eggs for his children. He met with this new convert to the church on Easter Sunday. And I think that is the first